There is a photograph sitting in a shoebox in a garage in Dayton, Ohio. In it, a man is standing in front of a building, a modest commercial space with a hand-painted sign above the door that reads Crawford & Sons Contracting. He is wearing a hard hat and a grin so wide it looks like it might crack his face in half. His name is Robert Crawford. He is 51 years old in that photograph, and he is standing in front of the thing he spent his entire adult life building. 2 years later, that building would be empty, the sign would be gone, the business would be gone, and Robert Crawford would be sitting alone in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, looking at his phone, unable to dial a single person in his contacts. Not his wife, Patricia, not his brother, not his 2 grown sons, because he did not have the words for what was happening inside him, and he did not know if he ever would. Most men in that parking lot, at that hour, with that much gone, do not come back. Robert Crawford came back, and the reason he did is the most important thing you will ever learn about the male mind. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you are about to hear is not a motivational story. It is not a highlight reel. It is not the kind of thing they put on a poster with a sunrise and a quote. It is something far more important than that. It is the true, documented, scientifically grounded account of what actually happens inside the mind of a man when he reaches the absolute limit of what he can endure and chooses, against every instinct that says lie down, to keep moving. But to understand what Robert Crawford did in that parking lot, and in the weeks and months that followed, you need to understand what brought him there. And that story does not begin with the business failing. It does not begin with the phone calls from creditors or the morning he had to tell his employees there was no more work. It begins the way almost every story about a man who refuses to quit begins. Decades earlier, in a childhood that quietly wrote rules into him before he was old enough to know the rules were being written at all. Robert Crawford grew up in Kettering, Ohio, just south of Dayton, the second of 3 boys raised by a father named Gerald who worked the floor at a GM assembly plant for 34 years, without missing a single scheduled shift. Not one. That is not an exaggeration. It is something Robert has repeated in every interview and conversation about his father, because it was the founding mythology of his childhood. Gerald Crawford did not call in sick. Gerald Crawford did not complain about his back, even when the doctors told him his L4 and L5 vertebrae were so compressed that most men his age had already gone on disability. Gerald Crawford came home at the end of every shift, ate dinner at the table with his family, asked his boys how school had gone, and did not talk about the things that were hard. Not because he was hiding them, but because, in the world he had been raised in, and the world he believed in, a man's suffering was between him and whatever he answered to at night. It was not dinner table conversation. It was not something you put on the table for other people to carry. You carried it yourself, and you kept walking. Robert watched his father do this for the first 18 years of his life, and without ever being told explicitly, he absorbed the operating system. Pain is private, struggle is personal, and a man who keeps showing up, no matter what, is a man worth respecting. He started Crawford & Sons Contracting at 34 with $1,700 in savings and a used pickup truck with 140,000 miles on it. His wife Patricia was pregnant with their youngest, a boy they would name Marcus, and the 2 of them had a conversation at the kitchen table one evening. The kind of conversation that young couples have when they are simultaneously terrified and completely alive, about whether this was the right time, whether they were being reckless, whether the world had room for one more small contracting business in the greater Dayton area. Robert told her they would figure it out. Not with bravado, not with the kind of manufactured confidence that collapses under pressure, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who has decided something and means it. Patricia believed him. She had watched him enough to know the difference between a man making noise and a man making a decision. This was a decision. For 17 years, Crawford & Sons grew. Slowly at first, local residential work, bathroom remodels, deck additions, the bread and butter of small construction in the Midwest. Then a commercial contract with a property management company that changed the scale of everything. By the time Robert was in his late 40s, he had 16 full-time employees, 3 trucks, and a reputation in the Dayton metro area, solid enough that new clients came through referrals without him having to advertise. He had built the kind of business that is built only one way, through years of showing up, through honoring every commitment, through doing the work himself when someone didn't, through being the last one to leave a job site and the first one to answer a call. His sons, Tyler and Marcus, had both come into the business. Tyler ran the crews. Marcus handled the books. It was the thing Robert had dreamed about at that kitchen table 20 years earlier, and for a window of time that felt both permanent and entirely too brief, it was everything he had said it would be. And then 2009 arrived. If you were running a small construction company in Ohio in 2009, you do not need this video to explain to you what happened next. The financial collapse of 2008 did not hit every industry the same way. But it hit construction like a wall. Projects froze. Commercial clients stopped returning calls. The property management company that had been Crawford & Son's largest account filed for bankruptcy and walked away from 3 outstanding invoices totaling just over $112,000. Robert had carried those invoices for 6 months on the assumption that the money was coming, because it had always come before, because the relationship was solid, because he trusted the people on the other end of it. When it became clear that the money was not coming, that it was simply gone, absorbed into a bankruptcy proceeding that would take years to resolve and return almost nothing, Robert Crawford did what he had always done. He did not call a lawyer immediately. He did not shut down operations. He looked at his books, looked at his payroll, looked at the faces of the 16 people who depended on him, and decided he was going to find a way through. He took out a line of credit he should not have taken out. He deferred his own salary for 4 months. He told Patricia that things were tight but manageable and that she should not worry, even though every night he lay awake staring at the ceiling doing math that did not add up no matter how many times he ran it. This is the part of the story that most people never see. Not the collapse itself, but the months before it, when a man is standing with his feet on ground that is crumbling beneath him and refusing to acknowledge it, not because he is delusional, but because acknowledging it feels, in his body, like the same thing as causing it, as though the act of naming the catastrophe will summon it faster. Psychologists who study male stress responses have a term for this cognitive pattern. They call it the provider trap, a state in which a man's identity has become so completely fused with his ability to provide and protect that any threat to that function registers not as a practical problem to be solved, but as a fundamental threat to who he is. The research on this is unambiguous. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology found that men who score high on traditional masculinity norms, specifically the norms around self-reliance, stoicism, and the provider role, are significantly more likely to delay seeking help during financial crisis, significantly more likely to internalize failure as a character flaw rather than a circumstance, and significantly more likely to experience what researchers describe as a collapse of self-concept when their provider role is disrupted. Robert Crawford was not a weak man. He was not a foolish man. He was a man who had been handed a particular definition of what a man is supposed to be, and he had lived inside that definition so completely and for so long that he had no identity outside of it to fall back on when things went wrong. By the spring of 2010, Crawford & Sons contracting was over. Robert laid off his last 3 employees in April, including a man named Dennis who had been with him for 11 years and who cried in the parking lot in a way that Robert still cannot describe without his voice going somewhere else. He dissolved the company in May, filed for personal bankruptcy in June, a process that required him to sit across a table from a trustee and itemize, in detail, every asset and liability he possessed. A process he has since described as one of the most dehumanizing experiences of his life, not because the trustee was unkind, but because the architecture of it demanded that he reduce himself to a set of numbers that totaled less than 0. He was 52 years old. He had no business, no income, a home with equity that had evaporated in the housing collapse, 2 adult sons who were now out of work because of something that had his name on it, and a wife who had stood by him through 17 years of building something that was now entirely and completely gone. He did not tell Patricia how bad the parking lot nights had gotten. He did not tell her about the thoughts that moved through him in the dark, the ones that a man does not say out loud, because saying them out loud gives them weight, and he is already carrying more weight than he knows how to hold. He drove. That was what he did. Long after Patricia was asleep, he would get in his truck and drive the empty roads outside Dayton, out past the subdivisions, past the industrial parks he had worked in, past the job sites where his crew had poured foundations that were now the floors of other people's lives. He drove the way men have always driven when they are trying to outrun something that is inside them and therefore has no geography. And on one of those nights, parked at a rest stop on I-75, with his engine idling and the dashboard clock reading 2:14 in the morning, Robert Crawford made a decision that he cannot fully explain even now. He made a decision that had nothing to do with a plan, nothing to do with a strategy, nothing to do with any of the practical steps that productivity books tell you to take when you hit rock bottom. It was smaller than all of that, and more important. He decided that the version of himself that was sitting in that truck was not the final version. He could not have told you why he decided that. He could not have pointed to a single piece of evidence that supported it, but something in him, something older and quieter and more stubborn than his fear, simply refused to accept that the story ended in a rest stop on I-75 at 2 in the morning. And that refusal, as irrational and unsupported as it was, turned out to be the most important thing Robert Crawford ever did. What happened next, and what the science of the human brain says about why he was able to do it, and why most men in that same parking lot would not, is where this story truly begins. Because the psychology of men who never give up is not what you think it is. It is not about willpower. It is not about toughness in the way that word is usually used. It is not about having more, or wanting it more, or being built differently from the men who stayed on the ground. It is about something that researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, in one of the most cited studies in modern behavioral science, identified as the single most reliable predictor of long-term success across every domain they measured. And it has almost nothing to do with talent, intelligence, or circumstance. By the time this video is over, you will understand exactly what is happening in the brain of a man who refuses to quit. From the neurochemistry of the anterior cingulate cortex to the specific thought patterns that psychologist Angela Duckworth identified in her landmark research on grit. And you will never look at persistence the same way again. You will understand why some men are forged by loss instead of buried by it. You will understand what Robert Crawford found in himself in that rest stop on I-75, and why finding it required him to lose everything first. And you will understand something that most people spend a lifetime getting wrong about the men in their lives, that the ones who seem the hardest to reach, the ones who go quiet when things fall apart, the ones who disappear into their trucks and their silences and their long empty drives, are often the ones who are fighting the hardest battle you cannot see. Stay with us, because what comes next will change how you understand every man who has ever refused to let failure be the last word.